This is the solution video for section 8.1, problem number 11. An object moves along a line so that its velocity at time t seconds is v of t equals 6 sine of 3t feet per second. For t between 0 and pi over 2, find the total distance traveled and the displacement of the object for t between 0 and pi over 2. All right, so what we need to remember, okay, a couple things. We need to know the displacement, remember, is the integral of the velocity, right, from A to B, and the total distance is the integral of the absolute value of velocity from A to B. All right, and so we want to write out our integrals. All right, so the integral displacement is going to be the integral from 0 to pi over 2 of the v of t, so 6 sine of 3t dt, and then the total distance is going to be the integral from 0 to pi over 2 of the 6 sine of 3t, right, with the absolute value dt. All right, so now let's start with the displacement because it's easier. All right, so integral of 6 sine of 3t, so I'm going to need a u substitution of 3t. So the integral from t equals 0 to t equals pi over 2, I'm going to put the 6 in front, and then I have the sine of u. All right, so now du is 3 dt, so I would need to put a 3 with the dt, which means I need to divide it by 3 on the outside. So I have sine of u du. All right, so 2 on the outside. Integral from t equals 0 to t equals pi over 2. All right, so if t is 0, then what is u? Well, u is 0. If t is pi over 2, then 3 times pi over 2 is 3 pi over 2. All right, of the sine of u du. All right, so now let's integrate. All right, so 2 times integral of sine is negative cosine of u. Evaluate from 0 to 3 pi over 2. All right, so I have negative 2 times the cosine of 3 pi over 2 minus negative 2 cosine of 0. All right, so now cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0. So 0 plus 2 times the cosine is 0. Cosine of 0 is 1. So 0 plus 2. So my displacement is 2. So what does that mean? That means that we are 2 units to the right of where we started after the pi over 2 seconds have elapsed. All right, so now the next one. Okay, what do I need to do? I need to figure out when 6 sine of 3t is positive and when it's negative, so I know how to split this up. All right, so I need to first of all find out when it's 0. 6 sine of 3t equals 0, so I divide by 6. So when is sine equal to 0? So sine is equal to 0 at 0, pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, right, and so on. So we would say 0 plus pi n, or just pi n, right? So that is 3t, so t is equal to, I divide by 3, so pi over 3 n. So what does that mean? Remember, n stands for any integer, so that would be 0 pi over 3, 1 pi over 3, 2 pi over 3, 3 pi over 3, 4 pi over 3, and so on. So t is equal to 0, pi over 3, 2 pi over 3, 3 pi over 3, 4 pi over 3, and so on. But remember, 0 is an endpoint, right? And pi over 3 is between 0 and pi over 2, but 2 pi over 3 is not. So our only values are 0, the endpoint, pi over 3, and then the other endpoint, pi over 2. All right, so now I have 6 sine of 3t. All right, and so I have a 0 here, a 0 here. All right, pick something in between 0 and pi over 3, right? How about pi over 4, right? So sine of 3 times pi over 4, well, 3 pi over 4, sine of 3 pi over 4 is root 2 over 2, but it's positive, right? So I put a positive there. All right, pick something over here. How about pi over 2? All right, 6 times 3 times pi over 2. 3 pi over 2, sine of 3 pi over 2 is negative 1, so negative 6, so I get a negative here, right? So what does that mean? That means for total distance, all right, we are going to split this up. We're going to integrate from 0 to pi over 2, the 6, not 0 to pi over 2, I'm sorry, 0 to pi over 3, right? Remember, when it's positive, the regular 6 sine of 3t dt, and then we're going to subtract the integral from pi over 3 to pi over 2, because that is when this velocity is negative. And then I'm integrating 6 sine of 3t dt. All right, so now we already know what the integral is. It's negative 2 cosine of u from what to what? Well, remember, now we actually need to change our limit. So 0 is 0, right? But pi over 3, 3 times pi over 3 is pi, right? All right, then I'm going to subtract the negative, so that would be minus 2 cosine of u from what to what. So now the lower limit, pi over 3, so if t is pi over 3, u is pi, and the upper limit is pi over 2, so 3 times pi over 2, so 3 pi over 2. All right, so now let's do the first one. Negative 2 cosine of pi minus negative 2 cosine of 0. All right, and then plus, here I get 2 cosine of 3 pi over 2 minus 2 cosine of pi. All right, so now negative 2 cosine of pi. Cosine of pi is negative 1, so this becomes positive 2, plus 2 times cosine of 0. Cosine of 0 is 1, so 2 plus 2, plus 2 cosine of 3 pi over 2. Cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0, so this becomes plus 0, minus 2 times cosine of pi. Cosine of pi is negative 1, so it becomes 2 plus 2 plus 0 plus 2, so 6. Remember, each one of these, this thing and this thing, when you put them together, they have to be positive, right? And each thing individually has to be positive because we took the absolute value. So I get 6.